So that podium has the microphone. Perhaps this one works. Is this one on? Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. Excellent. Are my slides showing? Excellent. I can't see from here, so. Well, thank you very much for the nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to join you for the Brain Education Conference because this has been my work for most of the past 30 years, looking at how is it that the brain works and how is it that the brain does its best work. I always like to begin these seances with this slide. It says, I hope I die during a conference speech because the transition would be so subtle. But hopefully this is not one of those subtle transitions for you. Instead, this is not even a speech, as much as it is a celebration of the mammalian cerebral cortex and how it got to the fascinating stage that it is today. It's by far the most exciting and by far the most complex of all objects in the known universe. Warrington Parker told me that there were going to be a lot of extremely wealthy people here today. So I'll ask you, how many of you own $1 million racehorse? If you did, would you keep him up until the wee hours of the morning? Would you let him skip 90% of his training program? Would you let him engage in a non-nutritious diet? Would you let him endorse a completely sedentary lifestyle, becoming a corral potato? Would you find it acceptable for him to play video games 3 to 4 hours a day? Would you let him consume alcohol and drugs and sometimes combining these with hallucinogens? Would you let him hang out with other unambitious horses? Would you let him watch 9,000 hours of television each year with 45,000 gratuitous murders of horses and expect him to somehow reach his full potential? If you did that to your horse, what would he be worth to you or to himself? And we have what I consider multi-billion-dollar brains, and we should make sure that we never allow our brains to be treated in ways that we would find it unacceptable to even treat a horse. Your brain is by far the most exciting organ that we're aware of in the entire universe. So what I'm going to talk about today is the whole notion of change and changing our attitude and changing the ways in which we think about learning and the ways in which we think about how is it that we best use our human brain. And we say that change is important, and without change, that process can be fatal. And this is an African proverb that says, every morning in Africa, the gazelle wakes up. It knows it must run faster than the fastest lion, or it will be killed. Every morning the lion wakes up. It knows it must outrun the slowest gazelle, or it will starve to death. So it doesn't matter whether you are a lion or a gazelle, when the sun comes up, you'd better start running. And as we think about the kinds of things that are most important for us to know and for us to do, it is a matter of running just to keep up, isn't it? We can no longer think about being complacent as if the world will wait for us. The world does not, and it never has. In 1998, Dr. James Appleberry wrote something called The Knowledge Explosion, and in it he said the sum total of humankind's knowledge doubled between 1750 and 1900. It doubled again between 1900 and 1950, again from 1950 to 1960, again from 1960 to 1965. It's been estimated that the sum total of humankind's knowledge has doubled at least every 5 years since then. Now remember, this was written in 1998, And he said by the year 2000, 7 years ago, 97% of what is known at that time will have been discovered or invented since those of us in this room were born. And even more important, it's been further projected that by the year 2020, knowledge or information will double every 73 days. So we can no longer focus on teaching the facts. Instead, our goal is to teach how is it that the brain does its best work, how is it that the brain understands, not based on memorizing. At one time, we said the noble gases argon, krypton, and neon could not form compounds, and a 31-year-old chemist, Neil Bartlett, didn't realize this, and he formed compounds. With the completion of the Human Genome Project, we recently found out that Aborigines in Australia have always been likened to Africans. But with the completion of the Human Genome Project, they found out that their genetic program is more closely associated with people in Southeast Asia than any tribe throughout the entire continent of Africa. All of the books, all of the facts are continuing to change with the latest research, and we'll see even more and more drastic changes to the so-called facts in the very near future. We've all seen articles about the brain and all of what we now are learning about how the brain develops, how the brain processes information, and there's no field that has been greater impact than the field of brain research. And as a result, we've learned more in the past 5 years than our previous 200 years of human history. Dr. Richard Restek, the president of the Society for Neurosciences, at a recent conference said over 90% of the neuroscientists who've ever lived are alive today, which almost suggests that if you get into this field, you'll live a long time. But it's not so much that this field sponsors longevity as much as it is brand new. And most of what we're doing is on the cutting edge of everything we're going to learn for the future about the human brain. And as a result, 20 Nobel Prizes have been awarded to neuroscientists in the past 25 years, which tells you there's no field that's growing and having greater influence than the field of neuroscience. But we are no further along than the Wright brothers were at Kitty Hawk after their first flight. We're just barely beginning to scratch the surface of what can be learned about the human brain. Most of you have heard that we use approximately what percent of the human brain? 5 or 10%. Anyone know where that figure came from? No. Then maybe we shouldn't use it. What happened was the early neuroanatomists were only able to identify 10% of what the brain did. So the assumption was that we only used 10% of the brain. But with PET scans, MRIs, and the brain imaging technologies, we see a tremendous amount of activity taking place in the entire brain for all complex cognitive functions. So if someone tells you that we use 10% of our brain, tell them, speak for yourself, I use 100% of mine. We're borrowing some fascinating tools from medicine to learn a little bit more about how the brain works. Many of you have probably seen pictures of this, like this, looking at the whole notion of intrauterine development. How is it that the fetus develops? And much of that was guesswork because we really couldn't go inside to find out very much before. You've all probably seen sonograms. How many of you have been pregnant? Women only? Women only. Okay. Some very fascinating things occur during the development of the fetal brain, and I'll tell you about that in just a moment. But you've seen sonograms that will show you what the fetus looks like as it begins to develop. Our latest sonograms look like this, where we can look at a tremendous level of detail now to see that developing fetus, and this is well before birth even begins to take place. With the brain imaging technologies, we can now look at the human brain when it's in an active state. We can see what happens to the brain before, during, and after an activity has taken place. We can see exactly what are the kinds of events that are taking place that are preventing learning, because we can see that occur inside the brain while the brain is in use. This is something called an angiogram, where we can look at cerebral blood flow. Inside your brain, you have approximately 40,000 miles of blood vessels and capillaries. Turn to your neighbor and say, that's fascinating, 40,000 miles. Some of these lifelines are so tiny that red blood cells have to pass through single file in order to get to their destination. But it's these tiny lifelines that get shut down when we're afraid, when we're tense, when we're impacted by fear. You've all heard of fight or flight. What occurs during fight or flight is that some of the blood that should be going to the brain gets sent to the large muscle groups to help us fight or run away, during which time the brain is underpowered. Whenever we're under stress or emotional duress, the brain cannot perform at its highest level. And this is why many of you may have noticed that sometimes after a test you have better answers than you did during the test. After the test, the stress has decreased, hasn't it? And your brain resumes a normal cerebral blood flow, and it now functions at its optimal level. Our latest angiograms look like this, colorized version, and you can see on the left-hand side a brain hemorrhage. And this is one way to identify a problem inside the brain before even initiating the smallest cut. We have brain images that show precisely where activation takes place during a cerebral activity. We can even tell whether a skill has been practiced or not. And some of these same technologies are now being used by the legal field. We can tell if Warrington has been killed. And the two suspects are me and his wife, Brenda. If pictures are shown to each of us of Warrington laying dead, the murder weapon, the murder scene, my brain, if I'm innocent, will process all of these events in the region of the brain that's basically observing and processing new information. If Brenda has seen all of these events, it shows up in the hippocampal region of the brain because that is indeed a memory, and the memory parts of the brain go online. While someone can lie to the court, someone can lie to the jury, you can even lie to yourself, but you cannot lie to your brain. It shows up immediately. And so we're beginning to look at the use of all these tools, not only in the courtroom, but also in the classroom of the future. With MRIs, this is an MRI machine, and we can now identify the changes in tissue that take place before, during, and after someone learns how to read. Dr. Sally Shaywitz at Yale University is now looking at what happens to the brain physically before, during, and after a child learns how to read, and we see tremendous physical changes. Every time you learn something, your brain changes. Hopefully, over the course of this week, your brain has changed tremendously based on what you've learned. A tremendous amount of what we're doing has been captured in a number of books, and you'll find more books in this field than perhaps in any other, because it's so new that you see a long list of books being published today, some of which are very accurate, some of which are speculative in some ways. You've all heard of people being left-brained or right-brained. Much of that work was done by Roger Sperry, for which he won a Nobel Prize, but the research was primarily on cat brains, not human brains. For all complex cognitive functions, the two hemispheres in the brain work in tandem via something called the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is the neural superhighway that allows the two sides of the brain to communicate. Left brain and right brain is more akin to looking at someone who's a left-handed versus a right-handed batter. The whole body-brain system is working, the orientation just changes. Neither hemisphere of the brain is quiescent and offline while the other one takes over a task. The two always work together. If you'll all take your fists like so, please. Bring them together. You've just created a model of your brain about the same size in relationship to your body. If you're seated next to someone with especially large hands, don't be impressed. It has nothing to do with intelligence or cognitive function. Okay? But turn to a neighbor and put a flat hand between your neighbor's two fists. Put a flat hand between your neighbor's two fists. What you've now modeled is the structure called the corpus callosum. That corpus callosum is an important structure. It takes about 9 to 10 years before it actually matures. And once it does mature, the brain can now process abstractions in ways it could not before. And this is why in most religions, the point at which you can become a member of the church is typically 9 or 10 years old once the brain can process religiosity and the abstract notions of religion. That part of the brain is also, once that matures, children are able to do things like fractions with very little difficulty. When we talk about developmentally appropriate content, sometimes it's about brain development, not about curriculum development at all. It's about how the brain is developing. But something else that occurs that's quite fascinating is that when the corpus callosum matures, we all lose touch with our childhood memories. And that's why we don't remember things that occurred. People will tell me, Ken, when you were a little boy, you did this, and I say, okay, I guess so. But I don't remember. With the maturation of the corpus callosum, we lose that touch with the childhood memories unless they're especially traumatic. But otherwise, we forget them completely. Put your corpus callosum back together again. I see some of you have performed an operation called a commissurotomy. Okay. Put that corpus callosum together again, please, with your neighbor. And as we talk about left-brained, right-brained, look your neighbor in the eye, say to him or her, left-brained, right-brained. Well, I use both of them because I have you, my corpus callosum. Yes, it's that brain, that's called my brain Valentine. It's that corpus callosum that truly makes the brain whole. And something quite interesting is that the corpus callosum in the female brain is about 23% thicker than it is in the male brain in several different regions, which allows for greater bihemispheric communication. And so we're now beginning to believe that the old notion of female intuition is neurobiological and not metaphorical, that women are indeed processing information. Only the women are clapping. Women are processing information that sometimes men are oblivious to only because our brains are designed to process information differently. We've taken some of this research and we see it translated all over the world, but it's all addressing the question, if it's your job to develop the mind, shouldn't you know how the brain works? And that has been the premise of my work over the past 30 years, understanding how the brain works. If you teach, you should know how the brain works, right? If you have children at home, isn't it helpful to know how the brain works? If you own a brain, isn't it important to know how the brain works? How many of you think you're losing your memory? How many of you think you're losing your mind? Okay. All of us believe we have some problem with memory, but it has to do with not the brain, but how we encode information into the brain. We typically say, I forgot, but it wasn't that we forgot. The issue is that we never encoded that information to process and store to begin with because we didn't think it was important. There's a whole issue related to learning about emotions that we sometimes ignore, but emotions drive attention, and attention drives all learning. And emotions is where all learning actually begins. And so our focus this morning is going to be focused on understanding the cognitive neurosciences and the major contributors of physiological, psychological, and biological aspects of learning, but also treating the issue of emotions. And we'll touch a little bit on learning and memory, and then what I call the 5 features of the brain considered classroom of the future. This is one of my favorite cartoons. If you don't understand this, turn to a much brighter colleague seated next to you. As the doctor explains to Kermit that there's something interesting going on inside, I'll share with you some of the interesting things that are going on inside of you as well, but I'll focus on just one part of the brain or the body system, and that is the brain. We typically say that college preparation begins in high school. We talk about college prep classes. However, college preparation begins well before kindergarten. It begins in utero. What happens inside the body of the mother in many ways determines the capabilities of the brain many, many years later. And so we're now not looking at what happens in elementary school, what happens in middle school and high school, but what happens in terms of the first 5 years of development, the first 3 years of development, and then what happens in terms of prenatal development, because nutrition and mother's stress impact the development of that fetal brain. We always say that learning takes place in the classroom, and that's why we want to send kids to school, but learning doesn't take place inside the classroom, does it? It takes place inside the brain, no matter where we take the brain. And sometimes some of the best learning we ever see happens outside of the classroom. Some of the best learning that I've ever seen took place under a jacaranda tree in Zimbabwe. Watching children learn, we say if kids are outside learning, there's so many distractions that they're going to have trouble learning. Actually, one of the best ways to learn is with distractions, because if you focus on keeping those out of conscious processing, it's easier to focus on something that you're doing. One of the best ways to read is outdoors, because you tune everything out in order to focus on something you want to encode inside the brain. I'm going to need a little help here to explain to you how the brain works. Lee, can you stand up, please? I'm going to try to throw this ball to Lee. If you can catch it, please. Good catch. Don't throw it back, I won't catch it. But something very interesting happens inside the brain. We always say things like, I have pictures inside my mind. I can picture and I can... Actually, we don't have any pictures in our mind. What happens inside the brain is because the brain does not have enough cortical real estate to store every experience as unique, what the brain does is it borrows from certain elements to construct networks where we have the same elements used to produce a memory. Lee and I, just a moment ago, as I threw the ball to Lee, the color yellow went to one part of your brain. The round nature of the ball went to another part of the brain. The spherical nature went to a region anterior to that. When I mentioned Lee's name, it went to the auditory cortex and the temporal lobe. But it all comes together for one experience. Inside your brain, you don't have enough real estate to store yellow tennis ball by itself. Yellow is used, and it's the same yellow element that's used for yellow taxi, yellow school bus, yellow banana, yellow lemon. And that's why one of the best ways we can teach and learn is when we make connections. We say this is like a, and we make a connection. That's how we remember. We say learning is not acquired, learning is integrated with prior learning. That's how we always remember. We make connections. And so inside the brain, we have connections from yellow to tennis to ball to banana to yellow school bus. I was in McAllen, Texas, and one young boy, when we talked about the yellow banana, he said, no, bananas are brown. And he was a very poor boy, and by the time his family got bananas, they were always brown. He made a different connection, didn't he? Because every brain is constructed in a unique fashion to represent your personal experiences. We say that your fingerprints are unique. Your brain is even more unique than your fingerprints. Even monozygotic twins have completely different brains based on how they process information and the specific experiences that they have had in life. David Perkins, in his book, The Mind's Best Work, said that good thinking is a matter of making connections and knowing what kinds of connections to make. I was recently speaking in Bozeman, Montana, and I made the connection that there are 24 beers in a case, and there are also 24 hours in a day. Coincidence? Now, that is a connection that we're not trying to make for those. I think there might be some kids in here. But that's not one of those connections we do want to make. But when we make a connection, as we mentioned with Lee, the tennis ball, yellow, and school bus, literally inside the brain, we have 100 billion neurons, and the job of the neurons is to make connections with other neurons. We used to say that the brain is like a computer. What we're finding now is that each neuron inside the brain is like a computer. And inside your brain, you have 100 billion neurons, and that literally translates into 100 billion networked computers, each of which can make as many as 200,000 connections with other computers. And that's why the brain is so amazingly powerful. What the brain does is it makes connections from what's known to what's new. And it always relates new information with old information. If the brain cannot make a connection, the brain cannot find meaning. If the brain cannot find meaning, the brain does not remember. because the brain translates anything else as being irrelevant because it has no meaning for us. But the brain operates in a very unique way. If you'll all read these colors beginning with the word yellow, read them in order, please. Okay, perhaps I should define the word unison. Okay. Most people have no difficulty reading the words, but if they're asked to identify the color and not read the word, what happens inside the brain is because the brain is so used to reading the words, we shift back to reading the words, don't we? And that's because the brain gets hardwired. We say practice makes permanent. Practice does not make perfect. Practice makes permanent. What happens inside the brain is that the brain gets hardwired, and that is that connections among the neurons become insulated. They get hardwired, and it becomes very difficult to engage in a new task because oftentimes the old ways in which we've thought begin to intrude in terms of our ability to process new information. Now, if you'll all sit up straight, please. Take a deep breath. Get additional oxygenated blood into the brain. I'm going to ask you to do a couple of things here. First, I'm going to ask you 10 quick questions. I need to get your answers as fast as you can. Ready? What color is this paper? What do cows drink? Cows drink water, yes. Cows do not drink milk. Some of you call yourselves teachers. I wonder what goes on in your classrooms. Yeah. Practice. We've made far more connections inside the brain among the elements. Cows drink milk, and I showed you white, didn't I? Those came together very quickly when I followed up with a question. You said, it must be milk. However, I had a different question, didn't I? And it should have led to a different answer. And this is one example of what happens in the classroom, and this happens even at home. When we ask children to give us fast answers, we don't get good answers. The best thing we can do is pose a question, let it sit there, and let the mind do its best work as it processes information. Fast is not good. Thoughtful consideration to the question, that's what we're after. For instance, here I have 2 pans of water in a perfect state of equilibrium. And I'll ask you, if I were to stick my finger into one side without touching the edge, the side, or the bottom, would that disturb the state of equilibrium? As long as I didn't touch the edge, side, or bottom, would that disturb the state of equilibrium? We'll let that question sit there. This is what we call putting the brain on auto-ponder. When the brain continues to ponder possibilities, that's when the brain does its best work. Too often we say, I want fast answers. Fast is not good as far as the brain goes. If I were to ask you to look at these 14 words, I'll give you 30 seconds to look at those words, please. Now, if you'll write down as many of those as you can remember, please. Write down as many of those words as you can remember. Okay, if you look up here, please. How many of you got embroidery? Good. How many of you got knitting? Good. How many of you got syringe? Great. How many of you got needle? Needle is not on the list. But this is how the brain organizes information. This is one of the faults of memory. It's based on how the brain processes, encodes, and stores information. Remember, we said the brain looks for categories. And within that category of thread, knife, syringe, silver, pen, sewing, shiny, is the word needle, isn't it? But needle was not on our list at all. But that is how the brain processes information, and this is why oftentimes so-called tricky questions on tests throw us off. And they throw us off because we make associations, because that is indeed how the brain works. In learning, the more we help students make those kinds of connections, but give them opportunities to discuss the kinds of connections they're making and why, the more we'll see learning taking place. This is how the brain organizes. This is how the brain stores. This is also how the brain learns and recalls. It retrieves information. When we talk about recollections, we're really recollecting the elements of any memory, and we're recollecting the pieces to construct the original idea. And so we believe that all answers in the Brain Consider classroom are indeed useful. And when students respond with a question after you respond with an answer after you pose the question, the best thing you can do is to say, yes, thank you. Thank you. Does someone else have another answer? Build on answers, extend the learning, make more connections. That's how kids get it. And if a student gives the wrong answer, tell them, if I change my question to blank, yours would indeed be the best answer. Help them make a new connection. Never tell them that it's wrong. Tell them, here is the question that goes along with the answer you just gave, because they may see that question and answer later, won't they? Helping make connections. That's when the brain does its best work. When students give answers, if you put all answers on the board and then ask students, what are your best answers and what is the best answer? Dr. Linus Pauling of Stanford University used to say that the best way to get a good answer is to get lots of answers, get lots of ideas from which we can select the optimal idea or answer, at which point we're indeed doing our best thinking possible. But as I mentioned, emotions drive all learning. Emotions drive attention, attention drives arousal, arousal dictates perception, perception and meaning are determined by all of the above. Meaning dictates comprehension, learning, short-term and long-term memory. But it all begins with emotions, doesn't it? Emotions are the drivers. Turn to your neighbor and ask him or her, do you always look this good, or is it just today? And I notice many of you are shaking your head. You say, yes, I do always look this good. Emotions are one of the most important aspects of learning. If you'll all put your hands above your head like you're being robbed, put your arms above your head like you're being robbed, and bring your arms down around the person seated next to you. And as you look around the room, you notice everyone is smiling. Okay? And that is because emotions help us relax if they're positive. Physical connections with other people, when they're positive, they help learning. In the classroom, the most important thing we can do is to set the stage for learning to take place. I was recently speaking not too far from here at Syracuse University, and on the way there I went to visit my brother and his family, and his son was going to the first day of second grade. And so he asked me if I would go to school with him. I said I'd be delighted to. And so I walk into a second grade class. I look a little big, a little old, but nonetheless, I go in there with him. But as every child came in, the teacher, Mrs. Axelrod, I'll never forget her name, Mrs. Axelrod gave every kid a hug as they came in and told them what a super year they were going to have together, how much they were going to grow together, how much they're going to learn together. What a fantastic year they were guaranteed to have. And as each child walked away from her towards his seat, you could see them almost walking 3 feet off the ground, feeling like $1 million. What she did was she reduced stress in the classroom. She reduced tension. She showed them that I'm on your side. We're in this together. We say children don't care what you know until they know that you care, right? But it begins with showing that you care. One last kid came in, a little chubby girl named Anita, and she gave her a hug, and she said, "Oh, Anita, so good to have you again," because she had Anita the previous year. "Oh, it's so good. You think we learned a lot last year? We're going to learn even more this year. Oh, we're going to have a super year together. Okay, Anita, you can let go. Okay, Anita, please let go. I can't breathe, Anita, let go." Little Anita finally let go and walked to her seat, wiping the tears from her eyes because she felt so good. But every child should feel that good in the classroom. It's very much like the TV show Cheers, where the theme song said, "Everyone knows your name and everyone's glad you came." And when a child has that feeling, you're going to accelerate learning every time, every day. If I asked you how you were today, most people would say fine. But if you look at this list of descriptors, turn to your neighbor and tell your neighbor, "That's how I feel today. I am..." Excellent. I received a phone call yesterday from a gentleman asked me yesterday on the telephone call, "Ken, how are you?" I said, "I'm so good that if I felt any better, I'd have to be twins." But we should all start the day feeling good. And part of the way we feel good is to make sure by 8 o'clock, no matter what's happened so far, we say, starting 8 o'clock, "I am smiling." I start to smile after 8 o'clock, no matter what's happened so far of the day. And for those of you who have difficulty smiling, put a pencil between your upper and lower teeth. And what it does is it activates the same series of muscles in your face that you would activate if you were smiling. And what happens is your brain says, "I think we're happy." I don't know why, but I think we're happy. And what goes on up here changes every other cell in your entire body. What goes on up here changes every other cell in your entire body. I recently had the good fortune to speak in Africa to educators in sub-Saharan Africa and Harare, Zimbabwe. This is a couple of years ago before all the trouble started there. But in the Natal region of South Africa, people are greeted with the expression "Sawubona." Here in the U.S., we greet people, we say hi. What does hi mean? Okay. I'm from Berkeley. Hi means something important in Berkeley, but hi may not mean what most other people think. But hi actually means my hands are held high. And when we hold our hands high, we wave them to show that they're empty. When we say hi, it means my hands are held high, and as I approach you, I'm not threatening. As opposed to, I approach you with my hands behind my back, and you don't know what to expect next to you. When I say hi, and I show that my hands are empty, that's our greeting that says, "You're safe with me." In the Natal region of South Africa, people are greeted with the expression "Sawubona." So please tell your neighbor, "Sawubona." And actually, that's profanity. That's the wrong slide. No, "Sawubona" means, I see you, I'm taking you in, and I like it. And that's how everyone should feel. Whether it's a student, a colleague, a child, or a spouse, everyone should be greeted in the morning with "Sawubona." And the response to "Sawubona" is "Sakona." So please tell your neighbor, "Sakona." And Sakona means, I am here now because of you. And the message is that a person is indeed a person because of our connection with other people. That's what defines who we are, and that's why diseases like Alzheimer's are so absolutely frightening, because we forget our connections with other people, and that defines who we are. The Danes greet one another by saying "Tak fasist." So tell your neighbor, "Tak fasist." And tak fasis means thank you for the last time we were together. And this is important because psychologists will tell you that the current status of any relationship is defined by the past 5 interactions you've had with that other person. So think about the past 5 interactions you've had with a student, with a colleague, with the spouse, with the child. That tells you where that relationship is right now. It's incumbent upon every one of us to make sure that every interaction we have with other people is indeed as positive as we can make it. Because when we do have positive reactions or positive interactions, we're always going to have positive reactions when people see us. And when we have positive reactions, that changes our whole physiology. Oftentimes you hear someone say, you know, Mrs. Johnson doesn't like me. And you'll ask, well, what did she say? Nothing. What did she do? Nothing. I can just tell. And believe me, people can tell you when you like them. Our faces we have 44 muscles in our face, but those 44 muscles can produce over 10,000 different expressions. And when someone likes you, not only can you detect the muscle series that indicates a genuine smile, when someone likes you, their pupils dilate. And this is why young lovers will sit at a table almost elbow to elbow, looking into each other's eyes and smiling. It's a dance of the pupils, communicating that important message that indeed I do like you. And this is why in the late 1800s, early 1900s, before women would go out in the evening, they would put eye drops in their eyes called belladonna that would dilate the pupils. And so as they went out in the evening, men would find them attractive because the message communicated physically by the expansion of the iris or the pupils. The message was, he likes me, she likes me. And women found that they couldn't see well, but they were very popular, very attractive. And everywhere they went, they were welcome. But most important, and the real purpose why we're here today, is in Kenya, people are greeted with the expression Kasirian Ngera. So please turn to your neighbor and say to him or her, Kasirian Ngera. And Kasirian Ngera translates into, and how are the children? If I see one of you and I ask you, hi, how are you? You say, fine. If I ask you, how are your children? Don't people begin to broadly smile, their eyes lighten? Everything about them changes when you ask, how are your children? We all love to talk about our children because we love them so much. The response to Kasirian Ngera translates into, all the children are well. And it's our job to make sure that the conditions that we set, the environment that we establish, always is such that we make sure that all the children around us are indeed well by us doing all of the right things to promote their growth and development. And in our classroom, this translates into the whole issue of cooperative learning. The more we have students involved in working together, learning together, doing the kinds of things that we've seen kids do here for the past week together, we see the best work. When we develop the climate of helping one another, we see more learning and more helping of one another. We typically say that learning is the teacher's responsibility, learning is everyone's responsibility in the classroom. And one of the things that I highly recommend is no matter where you are, if it's home or school, every school and every child's bedroom should have a chart like this. And every time I learn something, every time something happens to me in a positive way, I write on that chart, Warrington helped me learn X. Brenda helped me with Y. John showed me how to. Lee showed me that. If I write down all of the ways in which people help me learn, as they walk by, they get the public recognition for helping, don't they? And what you find is an environment where you find more and more people helping one another learn and become their best. We say that learning is constructed. Learning is really co-constructed. We do our best work with at least one other person. And the ways in which we maximize our opportunities for learning is when we work in groups together. We used to say that human beings were competitive, and that was partially based on the fact that most of the human skulls that we'd find always had cracks in them. But with some of the most recent, and the suggestion was that someone died from a blow to the cranial vault because someone hit them over the head with a club. The truth of the matter is that most of the skulls, with forensic pathology, some of the newer tools in that field, they've been able to identify that most of the skulls that we found cracked at the stress points and the sub-stress points in the human skull. That those skulls cracked during the fossilization process from the pressure of the earth. They didn't crack because someone hit them over the head. Human beings survived because we work together. And we say team means together everyone achieves more. And it's our job to maximize achievement by helping one another learn and become and do their best. There's a region of the brain that is activated when we work together very closely. It's called the orbital frontal cortex. And the orbital frontal cortex is just immediately behind and slightly below the eyes, but it's kind of the hub of the high road and the low road of the brain. The high road being the cognitive centers of the brain that process thinking, the lower road in the limbic system, the subcortical structures of the brain that are responsible for emotions. When we connect emotions and learning, we see our best work. We see our best memories. We'll skip that slide in consideration of time. This is something called Lessons from the Geese, and it emphasizes the importance of all of us working together as often as we can. And this says we live in an area where the geese are very common. We see them coming in the fall and leaving in the early spring, and their migration is an awesome sight. But there's an interdependence in the way the geese function. In fact, as each bird flaps its wings, it creates an uplift for the bird following. By flying in the V formation, the whole flock adds 71% greater flying range than if each bird flew alone. Lesson: people who share a common sense of direction and sense of community can get where they're going quicker and easier because they're traveling on the thrust of one another. Fact: whenever a goose falls out of formation, it suddenly feels the drag and resistance of trying to fly alone, and it quickly gets back into formation to take advantage of the lifting power of the bird immediately in front of him. Lesson: if we have as much sense as a goose, we'll stay in formation with those who are headed where we indeed want to go. Fact: when the lead goose gets tired, it rotates back into formation and another goose flies at the point position. Lesson: it pays to take turns doing the hard tasks and sharing leadership. People, as with geese, are interdependent with each other. Fact: the geese in formation honk from behind to encourage those up front to keep up their speed. Fact: the lesson, obviously, is we need to make sure that our honking from behind is encouraging and never something less helpful. Fact: when a goose gets sick, wounded, or shot down, two geese drop out of formation, follow him down to help him and protect him. They stay with him till he's able to fly again or dies. Then they launch out with another formation or catch up with their original flock. And the lesson: if we have as much sense as the geese, we'll stand by each other and we'll all be the better for it. One of the important themes of this conference is working together. And not only do we want to think about working together, what are some of the other kinds of elements that help with learning and personal development? We look at physical and pardon me, I get choked up when I talk about this. We look at physical involvement, emotional engagement, time allowed for internal dialogue. Internal dialogue is extremely important for learning. How many of you talk to yourselves? Yeah, that's good. If you quarrel, that's not. But if you talk to yourself, that's good. Before you engage in any complex cognitive task, you kind of walk yourself through the steps, don't you? If you listen to a 3-year-old while he's tying his shoe or doing something else, he'll talk about what he's doing, won't he? He'll talk about the steps because he tells him the steps involved. For all of us, as we get older, we become less audible, but we go through the same steps, don't we? Okay? It's that internal dialogue that's critically important. The non-threatening environment and opportunities for reflections, and then conversations that prompt revision and thinking. We do our best thinking when we have opportunities to revise our thinking to become more precise and better at thinking. If we look at how the human body is constructed, the amount of real estate in the brain devoted to different types of informational processing in the senses, you see how large the hands are? The brain, if we were trying to identify how much cortical real estate was devoted to each of these functions, this is kind of a scale of what that would look like. And you see there's a tremendous amount of cortical real estate devoted to the hands. And this tells us why hands-on learning is so powerful. How many of you have been pregnant? Okay, good. Couple of very interesting things happen during pregnancy. One is that the same tissue mass that becomes the brain, the other half of it becomes, guess what? The skin. Your skin is literally the other half of your brain. And that's why anything that you do with your hands goes immediately to the brain. That's why hands-on learning is so powerful. That's also why the number one activity that kids identify in America is show and tell. And that's because when other kids bring something to school, kids say what? Let me touch it, let me feel it, let me hold it, let me see it. Because that's how we get information into the brain. Something else occurs during pregnancy that's quite interesting, and that is that many of you probably noticed that during the first trimester in particular, you got very nauseous on a very regular basis, didn't you? The reason why, as I mentioned, the brain produces 200 billion neurons. That gets pruned down to 100 billion neurons before that fetus is born as a child. What happens, though, is that the delicate brain-building process requires that over 250,000 brain cells are produced every single minute. There are several stages during which over 1 million brain cells are produced during pregnancy. To make sure that nothing interferes with that delicate brain-building process, your job as hostess is to expel any toxins, any poisons that might interfere with that developing brain, which is why you got nauseous, and that was to protect the developing fetal brain and spinal column. Because if that infant is born with damage because of disease in the construction of the brain and spinal column, that's a problem that will last a lifetime, and that child will probably not live to reproduce. And our job is to survive and to reproduce. Not only are the hands important, movement is important. There are only 3 places in society where we insist on high degrees of immobility, and those are prisons, mental hospitals, and schools. Learning occurs best when we have opportunities to move. When we do so much as stand up, we add an additional 5% glucose to the brain. And the brain requires glucose for its processing. By movement, we add 5 to 15% additional glucose to the brain by just moving. That's how the brain does its best work, by moving. And this is why some of the early philosophers used to walk through a garden with the scribe behind them, writing down all the important things they had to say. But they were always walking, weren't they? They were never sitting. If I were to ask you to read that word, you'd all say. But if I drew a picture, it becomes a little clearer. If I showed a photograph, a realistic photograph, going from the concrete to the pictorial to the word apple is how the brain does its best work. Unfortunately, in teaching, we go the opposite direction oftentimes, don't we? Even more important, for effective concept development, we look at concrete representational, symbolic, or what I call first, second, and third-hand learning. The brain goes that direction, not the other. But even more important, if I gave you an apple, let you hold it and taste it, you're at the experiential level. And that's when it locks into the brain permanently. We say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. I say, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, what's an experience worth? And that's what the brain is after, experiences. It locks in those experiences for a lifetime. That's how the brain remembers experiences. The brain does not remember by words, and this is why lectures are so ineffective. It's because only 13 to 15% of the learners are auditory learners. We all learn best by doing, don't we? If that weren't so, couldn't I sell each of you a brochure on the country of Spain for $1,500 each? Instead of going, I say, just buy my brochure. you buy a ticket because you want to go to experience it, don't you? Because you want to smell it, you want to hear it, you want to feel it. And that's how you remember, from the experience, not from information. And the research shows that we remember 5% of what we hear from lecture, 10% of what we read, 20% of audio-visual information, 30% of a demonstration for us, 50% of a discussion group, 75% of practice by doing. But we say one of the best ways to learn is to teach something to another person. We say to teach is to learn twice. If you're going to teach something, don't you have to present it in some coherent fashion for you to remember before you communicate that to another person? That's how we do our best teaching, and that's how we do our best learning simultaneously. There are two Chinese proverbs that are among my favorites. One says, I hear and I forget, I read and I remember, I do and I understand. And the second is, to know and not yet do is not yet to really know. We learn best by doing. And when we do, one of the best things we can do is to write about what we did. Students can listen without thinking. We've seen students in our classroom, as we lecture, they'll be nodding like this, and all that tells us is that their neck muscles are operative. But you can sit without thinking, you can sit without even listening or thinking. You can even read without thinking, concentrating, or remembering. Any of you ever read a textbook and get to the bottom of the page and ask yourself, what did I just read? You know what we call that? Graduate school, don't we? Okay. But it's neurophysiologically impossible to write without thinking. It's neurophysiologically impossible to draw without thinking or to solve problems without thinking. And that's why those are so important for learning, to always have students write, draw, and solve problems. And this is based on some of my research that concluded that drawing does for the brain during the day what dreaming does for the brain at night. Drawing does for the brain during the day what dreaming does for the brain at night. Okay? But what we find is that the longer students stay in the current system where we have kids lecture and read, they don't do quite as well. And 91% of American teachers use textbooks and lecture 95% of the time. But for most kids, this is tough. Now, if you'll all sit up straight again, please. Get additional oxygenated blood in the brain through a deep breath. In, out, ah. I'm going to ask you to read along with me as the words appear on the screen here, and read in unison, please. Now, that's the story of what? Old Mother Hubbard. Old Mother Hubbard. Old Mother Hubbard went to the cupboard to get her poor dog a what? A fragment of osseous tissue, yes. And when she got there, the cupboard was in a denuded condition, with the consequence that the dog got none. Now, while the concept was completely comprehensible to everyone in the room, didn't the words get in the way? Unfortunately, this is what happens to too many of our students. They can learn, they will learn, but sometimes reading is not the best way, is it? The brain learns best by doing. As we look at the ways in which the brain does its best work, it's through the senses. We oftentimes refer to the 5 senses: sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. And we have specific kinds of brain cells inside the brain for processing each of them. And we say that when something's believed not to exist, researchers don't normally look for it. And researchers don't normally look for any senses beyond those 5, but we've been able to identify at least 19 senses, and we suspect that there are probably far more than those. There are even senses for which we've not given names just yet. But we say there may be as many as 75 to 80 human senses that we can calibrate, identify. But if we look at brain statistics, we typically will look at pictures like this. But if we look at these statistics of the brain is about 3 pounds. It's about 2% of the body's weight, but it consumes 25% of the oxygen, 25% of the nutrients, 70% of the glucose. We have 100 billion neurons. That's 15 times the number of humans on Earth. The number of glial cells, close to 1 trillion. For the cognitive functions, our brain does not develop like other parts of the body in proportion. The brain has different parts of it mature at different times. We recently found that in females, the brain takes approximately 24 to 25 years before it actually fully matures. In the male brain, it takes approximately 29 years before it fully matures, and some have speculated that it takes approximately 44 to 45 years before our brain actually matures. But if we look at what are the kinds of things that help the brain become its healthiest, the ways in which we develop that positive attitude, regardless of our age, all brains need water, exercise, sleep, stress reduction, oxygen, and nutrition. And I found this out several years ago as they talked about water, exercise, sleep, stress reduction, oxygen, and nutrition, and guess what they spell? WESSON. I said, I like that. But those, if you remember my last name, you'll remember those are the kinds of things that we must do all day, every day to make sure that development takes place. If we look at the human brain, this is what your brain looks like during an operation, and you can see the tiny blood vessels, and those are the blood vessels that get shut down during stroke or brain trauma. As I mentioned, the brain, unlike other parts of the body, the brain cannot store energy. The brain does not enjoy endogenous repair. You fall down, scrape an elbow, you get new skin, don't you? Damage the brain basically will rewire itself around the damaged region, but the brain does not develop a scab to correct itself. When you lose brain cells, you seldom get brain cells back in that same region. We used to say that when you're born, you got no new brain cells. However, what we find is with research from Rusty Gage, Fred Gage at the Scripps Institute for Behavioral Research in La Jolla, California, he took the brains of men between 57 and 72 years of age. We always said that after birth you got new brain cells. He found that these men between 57 and 72 years of age were cancer patients, and they get injected with a chemical called bromodioxyuridine, BRDU, bird do. As cancer cells spread, there are deposits of BRDU in the daughter cells as the cancer spreads, and you can identify exactly where and how fast cancer is spreading. Fred Gage autopsied the brains of these men and found that their brains were actually producing new brain cells at age 72. We used to say no new brain cells after birth. You get new brain cells throughout a lifetime. Your brain never stops producing new brain cells. And this is why most members of the president's cabinet are typically in their 50s, 60s, and 70s and at their cognitive peak. Their brains are doing their best work at 50, 60, and 70, which tells you at no age do you ever expect your brain not to be a healthy brain, not to be a productive brain. Your brain gets better with age. Now, we're supposed to end at what time, Warrington? 9:50? Okay. Okay, as you see, I'm on slide number 87 of 213. I have 12 minutes to finish. Someone locked the doors. I worked a long time on this. No one leaves until I'm through. We always believe that development takes place no matter what occurs. However, we're finding that that is not true at all. When tadpoles are in an area where there are no indications of land or any place for them to ground themselves, they continue to be swimmers. Their legs don't grow. Their arms don't grow. The proper environmental circumstances must be there or that development does not take place. The same thing occurs with children. When kids have no opportunities to see, to move, to hear, to use language, to learn how to read, there are windows in the brain that say, here's the time during which you must have exposure to that type of stimulus, or the brain cells devoted to that type of processing will go on to support a new function. And what happens is you lose that skill. Thornton Weisel and David Hubble received a Nobel Prize for some of their research on looking at the auditory cortex where there are brain cells for the left eye and for the right eye that process the same type of information, but each eye processes that information, and the brain cells devoted to that. What happens, though, is if the right eye is covered or patched for 6 weeks during infancy, what happens is the brain cells that would normally process right eye vision go over to support left eye vision, to the point where there are no cells processing right eye vision. And what happens is you wind up with a perfectly healthy right eye that's completely unable to see. The same thing occurs with language. If we don't hear language, the areas of the brain devoted to processing language will go over to support another function because we aren't processing language at all. There are windows during which specific types of competencies must develop. And if they don't develop, the brain says, we move on, and getting those brain cells to go back to their original designated function becomes impossible for a lifetime. And so if we think of all the kinds of things that we must do for child development, all the kinds of things we must do for emotional development, there are windows during which all of that has to take place. And if not, the brain says, I guess that's a function I don't need. Oh, this is some real good stuff, but you'll never see it. Oh, that's real good. Oh, gosh. Oh, and that. When we talk about patterns, emotions, relevance, context, and sense-making, emotions, as I said, are among the most important. We have something we call SAIL, and we say that for every environment, if you're interested in learning, whether it's home or school, kids must have safety, acceptance, involvement, inclusion, and lots of interactions, then they're ready to learn. But too often, don't we just start with the learning without any consideration about safety, acceptance, or involvement? This is not just true for children, it's true for every one of us. And that's why I wanted you to tell one another, Sawubona, how do you feel? You look so good. To feel safe, to feel accepted, because that's when everyone continues to learn and do their best learning today. And we know that touch is critically important. We used to have signs in the preemie wards at the medical center where I worked that said, do not touch the babies, and those babies who were not touched would grow at the anemic rate of about 12 grams per day. But by not changing diet or medications one bit, by just adding infant massage, those same infants would grow 42 grams a day instead of 12 by just adding touch. And that's why I wanted you all to hug one another. You're supposed to get 16 hugs a day for proper emotional functioning. So during the day, be sure to get your 16 hugs. Every person is supposed to touch. Unfortunately, in America, we pay people to touch us. We call that massage. But everywhere else in the world, we're constantly touching. And that's one of the best ways for all of us to learn, remember, and do our best. We've done experiments where we've taken the mother rat out of the cage with the pups, and when we do that, the pups go through an emotional stress reaction, and they physically stop growing. Put the mother back, they start growing again. put the mother back anesthetized, they don't grow. What happens is when the mother licks the infants, that's the signal that says everything is okay, and that turns on all the developmental systems again. They start growing, and they survive. And so the take-home message there is what? Lick your students. No, that's not the message. The message is that everyone deserves to be touched, and for different organisms, there are certain types of systems that go online because of touch. Okay? Ultimately, one of our goals is to see the you in me. Do you see the you in me? The word you is in me. And all of us must see the you in me for us to do our best work. And part of this is governed by a structure in the brain called the amygdala, and that's the emotional center of the brain. And the amygdala is attached physically to a structure called the hippocampus. The amygdala is critically important for laying down new memories, for emotions rather. The hippocampus is for memories. Memories and emotions go together, don't they? That's why in life we remember our highest highs and what else? Lowest lows, because they have emotional significance. And the brain says, put a bookmark there, I need to remember that. That's the work of the amygdala and the hippocampus. Something very interesting happens with that amygdala. Many of you have probably heard that when women are pregnant, they should not empty the cat litter because of something called toxoplasmosis. Toxoplasmosis is a disease caused by a parasite called Toxoplasma gondii. And Toxoplasma gondii can only reproduce in a cat's stomach. It starts off in a cat's stomach. It gets distributed through cat droppings. Other animals will ingest the oocytes as they eat food off of the ground. As they digest, the spores store themselves, and they really don't do any good unless they can get back into the cat to reproduce. And so, Toxoplasma gondii has a way to get itself back into the cat by manipulating the brain of rats. What it does is Toxoplasma gondii will cause the parietal lobe responsible for movement to disintegrate in such a fashion that rats become very slow. They affect the hypothalamus, the ventral medial hypothalamus, that is the satiety center, so rats don't know when to stop eating, so they continue to eat and they get what? Very fat. It affects the amygdala, so rats are no longer afraid of cats. Rats also will avoid places where they smell cat urine because that's where cats hang out, isn't it? Instead of avoiding places where there's cat urine, they're attracted to it. So what do you call a rat that's fat, slow, and attracted to places where cats hang out? Cat food, yes. And when cats ingest the rat, those spore cells get back into the cat where they reproduce. This is called host manipulation, where they literally manipulate the brain of the host to achieve their own purposes. And in education, part of what we want to do is to manipulate the brains of our students in such a way that we get the best work out of them. Ultimately, one of the most important things that we have to remember as educators and as parents is that you may be only one person in the world, but you oftentimes will meet the world to at least one other person. And many times, the students in our classroom recognize that we are the single most stable individual in their lives that entire year. You have more face time with students than their own parents do. And one of the most important things you can do with students is to give them a hopeful future. And there's an interesting story about two men in the medical center who were both placed into the same room because they had extended injuries. One had severed his spinal cord and had received an operation, and so he was laying prone on his back for over 6 weeks. His roommate had the bed next to the window. And so as the man lay prone every day, each day they would raise him about 60 degrees to help drain the fluid from his lungs, but otherwise he had to lay flat on his back. But while he laid in the bed, his roommate would always describe the wonderful things that he could see out of the window. And so he described a beautiful park where kids would play, lovers would walk arm in arm, children would sail their boats along the lake, ducks swam along the lake. He described the beautiful scenes that the man in the other bed lived each day to hear. One day, a parade was going by, and the man next to the bed, next to the window, described the beautiful parade and all of the exciting floats that he could see. And the man in the other bed listened and had his world enlivened as this man described with very descriptive details all of the wonderful things that he could see. But one day, the man whose bed was by the window passed away in his sleep. And so as the attendants took the body away, the other man asked if, well, can I be moved to the window, to the bed by the window now? And he was told, yes, you may. And so when they moved him, he found, as he finally stretched to look out the window, he found that the window was right next to a brick wall. That the man beside him actually was blind. Too often we believe that our job is to help people learn and do a lot of things, and one of the most important things that we can do is to be a good encourager. And this man indeed was that encourager, and he truly helped that other individual survive. Ultimately, this is how we want every student and child to feel, that he indeed is the best and is getting to be the best he ever will be. I just got a note that said I have 3 minutes, and I got the note a minute ago, so we're down to the last 2. We say students may forget what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And this is what I mentioned about Mrs. Axelrod. This is what we want to do, both as parents and as teachers. And we ask who's responsible. This is a story about 4 people named everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody. And there was an important job to be done, and everybody was asked to do it. Everybody was sure somebody would do it. Anybody could have done it, but nobody did. Somebody got angry about that because it was everybody's job. Everybody thought anybody could do, but nobody realized that everybody wouldn't do. And so it ended up that everybody blamed somebody when nobody did what anybody could have done for everybody's benefit. Okay? And everybody's benefit is basically taking the brains of kids and maximizing them in terms of their potential. And we say the sculpting is to a block of marble what our educational system should be to every developing brain. Every child should feel as though he has the skills and the tools and the attitude to be successful. And everyone should approach life, learning, and education in this fashion. Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that it ever has. And you are that group of thoughtful, committed citizens who truly can change not only Korea, but the United States in very important ways. And we all see the power of one. We saw what Rosa Parks did here in the United States. Dr. John Dewey, the noted educator. Dr. Charles Drew, the inventor of blood plasma. Dr. Benjamin Carson, the noted neurosurgeon. Albert Einstein, Dr. Harvey Cushing, the father of modern neurosurgery. And here's a frame to be filled by one of your children or one of your students, and it simply requires that you do the right thing. At the medical center, there's a little boy, and let me end with this story, a little boy whose sister was discovered to have the same disease that he did. He was now 7 years old. He had a very serious blood disease, and so over the years, he developed the antibodies to fight the disease so he could survive. But his sister, at 2 years old, was beginning to fade. And so she was going to die if she didn't get a transfusion. And he was the only one who could give her that transfusion. He was asked would he give his blood to his sister. He said, if it'll help Liz, I'll do it. And so as he laid in the hospital bed, you could see the color coming back into Liz, and you could see his face beginning to get paler and paler because he was losing blood. And so we asked the pediatrician, he said, "Doctor, will I start to die right away?" He thought that when he gave blood to his sister, he was going to die. But it was just giving a transfusion to his sister to help her live, and they were both going to live. As parents and educators, when we give to children, we're not going to die, but we should give them every drop of what we're made of. And it doesn't mean the blood, it's the encouragement, the spiritual encouragement that makes a child develop. And so let me end with this. It simply says, yesterday is history, tomorrow is a mystery, but today is truly a gift. And that's why it's called the present. And I'd like to thank you for sharing the present with me. You've been a wonderful audience. You've had a super year. Go forth and keep the brain in mind. Thank you. Thank you very much.